The Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. As a sergeant in the Imperial Guard, Bourgogne describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers, including brutal battles, extreme weather, and the struggle for survival during the retreat from Moscow. These are his words. Let's begin. On the 19th, the Emperor inspected us at the Kremlin opposite the palace, and on the same day I had orders to join a detachment of Fusilier chasseurs and grenadiers and a squadron of Polish lancers, 200 men in all. Our object was to keep the Empress's summer palace, at the farther end of Moscow, free from fire. This detachment was commanded by a general whom I took to be General Kellerman. We left at 8 in the evening, and it was 9:30 before we arrived at a spacious building looking about the size of the Tuileries, built of wood and covered with stucco to represent marble. Guards were immediately posted outside, and patrols were sent out for greater safety. I was sent with several men to inspect the interior to see if anyone was hidden there. I was fortunate in having this opportunity of seeing this immense building, furnished with all the combined splendor and brilliance of Europe and Asia. It seemed as if everything had been lavished on its decoration, and yet, within an hour it was entirely consumed. A quarter of an hour after we had used all the precautions possible against fire, it broke out behind us, in front of us, to right, to left, and we were unable to see who set it going. There it was in a dozen places at once and flaring from every attic window. The general immediately called for the sappers to try to cut the fire off, but it was impossible. We had no pumps and not even any water. Directly afterwards, we saw several men, some of them with torches still burning, come out from under the great staircase by some subterranean way and try to go quietly off. We ran after them and stopped them. There were 21 of them, and 11 others were arrested on the other side. These were not seen coming out of the palace, and nothing about them showed that they were incendiaries. More than half of them, however, were evidently convicts. The utmost we could do was to save some pictures and a few other valuables, amongst which were imperial ornaments, velvet mantles lined with ermine, besides many other precious things which we afterward had to leave behind. About half an hour after the fire broke out, a furious wind got up, and in less than 10 minutes we were hemmed in by the fire and could neither advance nor retreat. Several men were hurt by falling pieces of burning timber. It was 2 o'clock in the morning before we could get out of this hell, and we then found that the fire had spread for more than half a league all around, for the whole of this quarter was built of wood and was very beautiful. We set out again to return towards the Kremlin, taking with us our prisoners, 32 in number. I was put in command of the rear guard and the escort of the prisoners, with orders to bayonet those who tried to run away or refused to follow. 2/3 of these wretches were convicts with sinister faces, the other were middle-class citizens, and Russian police recognized by their uniforms. As we went along, I noticed amongst the prisoners one who was muffled up in a fairly clean green cloak, crying like a child, and saying repeatedly in good French, "Mon Dieu, I have lost my wife and my son in the fire." He seemed very unhappy, so I asked him who he was. He told me that he was Swiss and came from near Zurich, and that for 17 years he had been at Moscow teaching German and French. He then began again to cry out in despair, always repeating, "My dear son, my poor son." I was very sorry for the poor fellow. I tried to comfort him, telling him that very likely he would find them, and as I knew that he would be condemned to die with the others, I determined to save him. 2 men walked near him arm in arm, one young and the other middle-aged. I asked the Swiss who they were. He told me they were tailors, a father and son. "But," he said, "the father is happier than I. He is not separated from his son, and they can die together." He knew the fate that awaited him. He had heard the order given in French. While he was speaking to me, he stopped suddenly and gazed wildly in front of him. I asked him what was the matter, but he did not answer. Soon afterwards, he sighed heavily and began to weep again, saying that he was looking for the place where his house had stood, and that it must be there as he recognized the large stove still standing. I must here say that we could see as plainly as in broad daylight, not only the town itself but far beyond. Just then, the head of the column, which was detached from the Polish lancers, stopped still, not knowing where to turn, as the narrow street was completely blocked up. I took advantage of this delay to let the unhappy man satisfy himself whether the bodies of his wife and son were among the ashes of his house, and I offered to accompany him. We went to the site of the house, and at first saw nothing to confirm his suspicions. I was beginning to comfort him, saying that no doubt they were saved, when, at the entrance to the cellar, I saw something blackened and without form, all twisted up. I examined it, and found it to be a dead body, but whether man or woman, it was impossible to see. I had hardly time either, for the Swiss, who had come up behind me, uttered a frightful cry and fell to the ground. I raised him with the help of a man who stood near, but when he came to himself, he rushed in despair all over the ruins of his house, and with another terrible cry he called for his son and flung himself into the cellar, where I heard him fall heavily like an inert mass. I did not wish to follow him. I hastened to rejoin the detachment, reflecting sadly on what I had just seen. One of my friends asked me what I had done with the man who spoke French, and I told him of the tragic scene I had just witnessed. As we were still halted, I asked him to come and see the place. We went to the cellar door and heard groaning. My comrade proposed to go down and help him, but knowing that to save him from the cellar was to lead him to certain death, as all the prisoners were to be shot. I said that it would be very foolhardy to descend into such a place without a light. Luckily, the order to arms was given at that moment. We waited while the left column started, and as we were preparing to follow, we heard steps behind us. I turned around and was astounded to see the poor Swiss, looking like a ghost, and with his arms laden with furs to cover the bodies of his wife and son. He had found his son dead in the cellar, but not burnt. The body at the door was his wife's. I advised him to return to the cellar and hide himself till we had left, when he could perform his painful duty. I do not know if he understood me, but we left him. We reached the Kremlin at 5 o'clock in the morning and put the prisoners in a place of safety. But I took the precaution to keep back the two tailors, father and son, on my own account. As will be seen, they were very useful to us during our stay in Moscow. On the 20th, the fire had slackened a little. The governor of the town, Marshal Mortier, and General Milhaud, who was appointed commandant of the place, were both very active in organizing a body of police. This was formed from the Italians, German and Frenchmen living in Moscow, who had escaped Rostopchin's rigorous orders to leave the city by hiding themselves. While I was looking out of the window of our quarters at midday, I saw the shooting of a convict. He refused to kneel down, but met his death bravely, and striking his breast, he seemed to defy his executioners. A few hours later, our prisoners met with the same fate. I spent the day quietly enough, but at 7 o'clock, the Adjutant Major Delettre ordered me to surrender myself at a place he named for having allowed 3 prisoners entrusted to me to escape. I made what excuses I could and went to the place indicated. Other non-commissioned officers were there already. I reflected that my conscience was quite clear for having saved the lives of these men, convinced as I was of their innocence. The room I was in opened onto a long narrow gallery connecting the house with another wing of the building. A part of this wing had been burnt so that no one inhabited it, and I noticed that the portion still standing had not been examined. I was naturally curious to see it, and having nothing to do, I went to the end of the gallery. I fancied I heard a noise coming from a room with a closed door. I listened and thought I distinguished the words of a language I did not understand. I knocked at the door, but no one answered and profound silence followed. I then looked through the keyhole and saw a man lying on a sofa and two women standing who appeared to be keeping him from talking. I knew a few words of Polish, which is much like Russian, so I knocked again and begged for some water. No answer came, but at my second request, which I made more forcible by a kick on the door, they came and opened it. When I entered the room, the two women rushed out into another. I closed the door, but the man on the sofa never moved. At once I recognized him for a criminal of the lowest type, dirty all over, from his beard to his boots. His clothes consisted of a sheepskin cloak and a leather belt. Near him were a lance and two torches, beside two pistols at his belt. These last I took from him, and seizing one of the torches, I hit him on the side with it and made him open his eyes. On seeing me, he jumped up as if to spring upon me, but fell flat down again. I aimed one of his pistols at him, but he only gazed at me stupidly and, trying to rise, fell again. After some time, he at last succeeded in keeping on his feet. Seeing how drunk he was, I took hold of his arm and, leading him from the room, I took him to the end of the gallery. When we reached the top of the staircase, which descended straight down like a ladder, I gave him a push. He rolled down like a barrel and fell almost against the guardroom door opposite the stairs. The men dragged him to a room where they locked up all of his description, and I did not hear him speak again. This expedition over, I returned to the room where I had found the man and shut myself in. I looked well around to see that there was no one about. Then opened the second door and saw the two Dulcineas sitting on a sofa. They did not seem surprised to see me, but both started talking at once, I not understanding a word. I tried to ask them if they had anything to eat. They understood me perfectly and gave me cucumber, onions, a large piece of salt fish and a little beer, but no bread. Afterward, the younger of the two brought me a bottle of something she called kosalki. When I tasted it, I knew it was Danzig gin. In less than half an hour, we had emptied the bottle, my two Muscovites doing more service than I. I stayed for some time with these two sisters, and then I returned to my room. I found there a non-commissioned officer of my company who had been waiting for me a long time. When I related my adventures, he seemed delighted as he could find no one to wash clothes. He seemed to think the two Muscovite ladies would be only too much honored by being asked to wash and mend for French soldiers. We waited until 10 o'clock when everyone was asleep, as we wished to keep our secret. Then the non-commissioned officer returned with the sergeant major, and we went to look for our beauties. They made a lot of difficulties at first, not quite knowing where we were taking them, but making me understand I was to go with them. I went as far as our quarters, where they followed us willingly, laughing as they went. We found a small room at liberty, which we made over to them, furnishing it with whatever we could find, all kinds of pretty things which the noble Muscovite ladies had not been able to carry away. Although our friends had had the appearance of common servants, they were thus transformed into elegant ladies. Ladies, however, who had to wash and mend for us. On the next morning, the 21st, I heard a loud report of firearms, and was told that several convicts and members of the police force had just been shot. They had been caught setting fire to the Foundling Hospital and to the hospital containing our wounded men. The sergeant major came to tell me directly afterwards that I was free. When I got back to our quarters, I saw that the two tailors I had saved were already at work making some capes out of the cloth off the billiard tables we had taken to pieces. I went into the room where we had left our women and found them at the washtub, making but poor work of it. This was very natural, however, as they were wearing some silk dresses belonging to a baroness. But for want of anything better, one had to put up with it. During the remainder of the day, I was busy arranging our quarters and getting in provisions, as we were apparently to stay here for some time. To last for the winter, we had 7 large cases of sweet champagne, a large quantity of port wine, 500 bottles of Jamaica rum, and more than 100 great packets of sugar. And all this was for 6 non-commissioned officers, 2 women, and a cook. Meat was difficult to get, but on this evening we had a cow. I don't know where she came from, but probably from some forbidden place, so we had to kill her at night to escape observation. We had a large number of hams, having found a shop full of them. Add to all this a quantity of saltfish, a few sacks of flour, 2 large barrels filled with suet, which we had taken for butter, and as much beer as we wanted. These constituted our provisions in case we had to spend the winter in Moscow. In the evening, orders were given for a roll call at 10 o'clock. 18 men were missing. The remainder of the company slept luxuriously in the billiard room, lying on rich furs, sable, lion, fox, and bear's skins. Many of them had their heads wrapped up turban fashion in fine cashmeres, looking in fact like sultans instead of grenadier guards. Only the houris were wanting to complete the picture. I prolonged my roll call to 11 o'clock so that I would not have to report the absent men. And they returned soon afterwards, bending beneath their burdens. Amongst other valuable things they brought were several silver plaques in relief. Also, each had a silver ingot, the size and form of a brick. For the rest, there were furs, Indian shawls, and silk stuffs brocaded in silver and gold. They asked for leave to make 2 other journeys to fetch some wine and preserved fruits left behind in a cellar. I gave them permission, and the corporal went with them. We non-commissioned officers had a right to 20% of all the things saved from the fire. On the 22nd, we rested, added to our stock of provisions, sang, smoked, laughed, and drank, and amused ourselves. I paid a visit the same day to an Italian print seller whose house had escaped the fire. On the morning of the 23rd, a convict was shot in the courtyard. That same day, we had orders to be ready the next morning for inspection by the Emperor. At 8 o'clock on the morning of the 24th, we set out for the Kremlin. Many other regiments were collected there for the same reason, and that day, many medals were given and many promotions made. Those who were rewarded deserved well of their country, having shed their blood many times on the field of battle. I took advantage of this occasion to look at all the wonderful things in the Kremlin, and while several other regiments were being inspected, I went to see the Church of St. Michael, the tomb of the Russian emperors. Some soldier of the Guard, the first chasseurs, picketed at the Kremlin, had come here the first day of our arrival, hoping to find the treasure said to be concealed. They searched through the enormous crypt, but found instead of treasures nothing but tombs in stone covered over with velvet, having inscriptions on silver plates. They found also several people from the town who had fled there for refuge, thinking that the presence of the dead would protect them. Amongst them was a pretty young woman, said to belong to one of the best Moscow families, who had foolishly become infatuated with one of the superior officers. She behaved more foolishly still by following him in the retreat. Like so many others, she died of cold, hunger, and want. After the crypt of St. Michael, I went to see the famous bell. It is 19 feet high, and a great part of it is embedded in the earth, probably by its own weight, as it has lain on the ground ever since the fire burned down the tower in which it hung. Near it and opposite the palace is the arsenal, with an enormous cannon on each side of the door. On the right, farther off, is the cathedral. Its 9 bell towers covered with gilded copper. The cross of Ivan the Great is on the highest tower and dominates them all. It is made of wood, 30 feet high, covered with silver gilt plates, and is held in its place by gilded chains. Some days after this, the men on extra duty, carpenters and others, were ordered to take down this cross to be conveyed as a trophy to Paris. But on their attempting to remove it, it fell by its great weight, nearly killing the men who were dragged down by the chains they held. The same thing happened with the great eagles on the towers around the Kremlin walls. It was midday by the time we had been inspected. We went out by the arched gateway containing the great Saint Nicholas. Several Russian slaves were praying there, bowing and crossing themselves before the saint. They were no doubt making intercession against us. On the 25th, I and several friends explored the ruins of the town. We saw much that we had not seen before. Everywhere we met Russian peasants, women dirty and repulsive, some of them Jews, mixing helter-skelter with soldiers and searching in cellars for things which might have escaped the fire. Besides wine and sugar, they were loaded with shawls, cashmeres, magnificent Siberian furs, stuffs brocaded with silk, gold and silver, and several with silver plate and other precious objects. There were Jews there too, with their wives and daughters, making all kinds of offers to our men for the possession of our things. On the evening of the same day, a Greek church opposite to us was set on fire, close to the place where Marshal Mortier was quartered. We could not extinguish the fire, in spite of all our efforts, and this church, which was in beautiful preservation, was reduced in an incredibly short time to ashes. Many unfortunate people had taken refuge there with the few things remaining to them. This made the circumstance much worse. On the 26th, I was on guard over the Emperor's carriages in a coach house at the farther end of the town. Opposite were some large barracks, saved from the fire, where part of our army was quartered. To get there, I had to traverse more than a league of ruins on the left bank of the Moskowa, only seeing here and there a few rafters of the churches left. Everything else was reduced to ashes. On the right bank, a few pretty country houses were still left, only partially burnt. Close to where I placed my guard, there was a house that had quite escaped the flames, and out of curiosity, I went to see it. I met by chance there a man who spoke French very well, who told me he came from Strasbourg and had been led by fate to Moscow only a few days before us. He also said that he was a wine merchant dealing in Rhine wines and sweet champagne, and that by strokes of bad luck he had lost more than 1 million, partly on account of wine destroyed in shops by the fire, and partly by all we had drunk and were still drinking. He had not even a piece of bread to eat, so I asked him to come and share my rice soup. He accepted gratefully. The Emperor issued orders for a thorough organization in Moscow in preparation for remaining there for the winter while waiting for peace. The first steps taken were for a hospital for the wounded, the Russians being treated like ourselves. The stores of provisions scattered through the town were concentrated as much as possible. Several churches, which had escaped the fire, were reopened for worship. Near our quarters was a Catholic church, where an emigrant French priest said Mass. A theater was even opened where French and Italian actors played comedies. At least, so I was told. But whether this was true or not, I know they were paid in advance for 6 months, in order to convince the Russians that we were going to remain for the winter. On the 27th, I was agreeably surprised to meet 2 of my fellow townsmen coming to see me. These were Flamand from Pérouvels, Vélit in the Dragoon Guards, and Melee, a dragoon from the same regiment from Condé. They were very welcome, for that day we felt merry. So we invited them to dine and spend the evening with us. In the men's various foraging expeditions, they found a quantity of men's and women's costumes of all nations, even French dresses of the time of Louis XVI, all of most beautiful material. So this evening, after dinner, we decided to have a ball and wear all these dresses. But I must not forget to say that Flamand had told us a sad piece of news. The loss of the brave Lieutenant Colonel Martod, who commanded the regiment. on reconnoitering in the outskirts of Moscow, 2 days before the 25th, they had fallen into an ambuscade and were attacked by 3,000 men, both cavalry and infantry. Colonel Martaud was mortally wounded. A captain and the adjutant major were made prisoners after fighting desperately. 2 days later, we heard that the colonel was dead. Now I must return to our ball, a real carnival, as we were all disguised. First of all, we dressed up the Russian women as French marquises, as they knew nothing of the business. Flamand and I superintended their toilette. Our 2 Russian tailors were dressed as Chinese, I as a Russian boyar, Flamand as a marquis, each of us in different costume, even our cantinière, Mother Dubois, who wore a beautiful Russian national dress. As we had no wigs for our marquises, the regimental perruquier dressed their hair. For grease, he used sweat and flour for powder. They looked splendid, and when everyone was ready, we began to dance. I forgot to say that during all this time we drank a great deal of punch dealt out to us by Melee, the old dragoon. Our marquises and the cantinière, although they could stand a good deal, were beginning to feel their heads swim in consequence of the large quantities they had swallowed. For music, we had a flute played by a sergeant major, accompanied by the drum to keep time. We began with the air. On va leur percer les flancs. Ram, 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 tam plan. Tire lire, ram plan. Just as the music struck up, however, and Mother Dubois advanced with our quartermaster, our marquises, excited no doubt by the music, began to jump like Tartars, flying from right to left, swinging their arms and legs, falling backward, getting up only to fall again. They seemed to be possessed by the devil. There would have been nothing so very extraordinary had they worn their Russian clothes, but to see 2 French marquises jump about like lunatics made us nearly die with laughter, and the flute player was obliged to stop playing the drum, filling up the pauses by sounding the attack. The marquises began again with redoubled energy until exhausted they sank to the floor. We lifted them up and applauded them, and then we went on drinking and dancing until 4 o'clock in the morning. Mother Dubois, true to her trade and knowing the full value of the clothes she wore, silk brocade in gold and silver, went off without a word. As she left, however, the sergeant of the guard on police duty, seeing a strange lady in the street so early, and thinking he had found a prize, went to her and tried to take her by the arm and lead her to his room. But Mother Dubois, who had a husband and moreover had drunk a good deal of punch, dealt the sergeant such a vigorous blow on the face that she knocked him completely over. He shouted out, and as we had not gone to bed yet, we ran down to help him. The sergeant was so furious that we had a great piece of work to din into his head that he must not arrest a woman like Mother Dubois. The 28th and 29th, we spent in looking after our provision. We went out in reconnoitering parties during the day, and at night we went back to take the things away. On the 30th, we were inspected in the street opposite our quarters. When it was over, it occurred to the colonel to show the inspector how the troops were quartered. When the turn of our company came, the colonel took the captain and the sergeant of the week with him, and the adjutant major, Rostan, who knew our quarters, walked in front and opened all the doors. But unfortunately, we had not removed the key from the door of our Dulcinea's little room, which everyone had taken for a cupboard. This the adjutant major opened, and surprised at seeing a space within, he looked and saw our birds. He said nothing, locked the door, and put the key in his pocket. When he was in the street, he held up the key on seeing me, and coming up to me, he laughed. "Ah," he said, "you have some caged birds, and you keep them all to yourselves. What in the devil's name do you do with those queer customers? And where did you find them? There are not many about." I told him then how I had found them and how we kept them to wash our clothes. "Well then," he said to the sergeant major and me, You might lend them to me for a few days to wash my shirts, as they are horribly dirty. I hope you will be friendly and not refuse me this. Yep. He took the women away the same evening, and no doubt they washed all the officers' shirts, as they did not come back for 7 days. A strong detachment of the regiment was sent on October the 1st to plunder a large country house some leagues from Moscow. We found very little, only a cart loaded with hay. As we returned, we met some Russian cavalry who began caracoling around us without meaning to attack us seriously. We marched, however, in such a way as to show them that the advantage would not be theirs, for although far fewer in numbers than they were, we had disabled several of them. They followed us to within a quarter of a league of Moscow. On the 2nd, we heard that the Emperor had given orders to arm the Kremlin. 30 pieces of cannon and howitzers of various calibers were to be placed on all the towers around the outside wall. The men on extra duty of every regiment of the Guard were commanded on the 3rd to dig and carry away all the materials coming from the old walls around the Kremlin, which the sapper engineers had demolished, and all foundation which had been undermined. On the 4th, I went in my turn with the extra duty men of our company. The next day, the colonel of the engineers was killed close to me by a brick from a mine just exploded. On the same day, I saw near a church several dead bodies with the legs or arms eaten away, probably by wolves or dogs. On the days of duty, we drank, smoked, and laughed, talking of France and the distance separating it from us, and the possibility of being sent still farther off. When evening came, we invited our Muscovite slaves to join us, or rather our 2 marquises, as we called them since the night of the ball, and we sat drinking Jamaica rum punch. The remainder of our stay in the town was passed in reviews and parades up to the day when a courier came to inform the Emperor in the middle of a review that the Russians had broken the armistice and had taken Murat's cavalry by surprise. The order to leave was therefore given, and the whole army was in instant movement, but our regiment only knew in the evening that we had orders to leave the next day. We gave the Muscovite women and the 2 tailors their share of the booty, which we could not carry away. They threw themselves on the ground to kiss our feet 20 times. Never had they imagined such riches. That concludes the 4th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.